The morning of September 17th began like any other in the quiet town of Ashridge, Colorado. Sunlight spilled lazily over the rooftops, dogs barked in backyards, and the hum of life moved on, blissfully unaware that civilization's countdown had already begun. Captain Elijah Grant, a decorated ex-military survivalist, sipped his black coffee from the porch of his cabin, nestled in the pine-draped outskirts of town. He had retired early, wanting to escape the politics and chaos of Washington. But on this particular morning, his instincts stirred. The birds weren't singing. No wind rustled the trees. It was the kind of silence he had learned to fear during his combat years. 50 miles away, chaos erupted at Fort Halberd, a secretive government facility known only to the highest levels of military intelligence. Scientists there had been working on a classified virus, something meant to enhance immune response in combat soldiers. It was meant to save lives. Instead, it broke the natural order. Within minutes of exposure, infected test subjects experienced muscle spasms, then paralysis, and finally reanimation. But they didn't just come back, they came back violent, primal, and with one insatiable instinct: to spread the infection. The infection leaked. No alarms. No broadcast warnings. Only silence. Fort Halberd was gone within hours, and the undead spilled into the nearby cities before anyone even knew something was wrong. By the time the evening news tried to explain, it was already too late. In Ashridge, Mayor Carla Mendez received a scrambled emergency call from a state trooper stationed 20 minutes away. "There's something wrong, people are eating each other, don't let anyone leave town, burn the roads if you have to." Then the line went dead. Panic hadn't reached the streets yet. Parents were still driving home from school pickup, teenagers were hanging out at gas stations, and the sheriff's department was trying to track down a stolen vehicle. Only a few had noticed the strange figures limping up the road from the woods, people who looked injured, disoriented, and disturbingly silent. Elijah was one of the first to notice the scent. Rot. Decay. He followed it down a back trail and found a bloodied Ranger truck, doors ripped off, but no body inside. Claw marks were etched into the driver's seat and the windshield was smashed out. Whatever did this wasn't a bear. Back in town, a patrol officer named Jenna Lee pulled into the small grocery store parking lot after receiving a call about a man attacking a woman. When she approached the scene, she found a man hunched over another body, tearing into flesh like it was raw steak. She shouted. No reaction. She drew her weapon, stepped closer, and the man turned. His eyes were gray, his face slack and blood-slicked, and his jaw dislocated unnaturally as he lunged. Jenna fired. Once. Twice. 3 times. Center mass. He stumbled, but didn't stop. Only a shot to the head put him down. That moment marked the beginning of the town's realization. Back at Town Hall, Mayor Mendez was trying to keep calm as reports poured in, people vanishing, phones going silent, roads blocked by overturned vehicles. She called for a town-wide curfew, ordering every available officer and volunteer to begin rounding up residents and sheltering them in the school gymnasium. Elijah made it into town just before nightfall. He found Sheriff Bill Hankins outside the hardware store, boarding up windows with 3 volunteers. "You smell it?" Elijah asked. "Smell what?" "The end of everything." By midnight, the town's population had dropped by 1/3. Cell towers went offline. The power grid flickered. And the school, now filled with nearly 200 frightened civilians, echoed with cries of children and whispered prayers. But safety was an illusion. One infected had made it inside, hidden among the evacuees. And when he turned, quietly, painfully, in the shadows of the storage room, he bit the woman nearest to him. The countdown had already begun inside the safe zone. Meanwhile, Elijah stood on the gym roof, scanning the distant woods with binoculars. Movement. Shadows in the tree line. Not animals. Not survivors. He looked at the horizon, and watched as the last lights of the next town over blinked out. Ashridge was alone. And the dead were coming. Next track button. End of part 1. Would you like me to continue with part 2, or would you prefer a complete outline of all 8 parts first? The gymnasium was filled with the harsh sound of whispers and frantic murmurs. Elijah stepped inside, his boots scraping against the cold, linoleum floor. The large space had been transformed into an impromptu shelter. Some had made makeshift beds out of blankets and gym mats, while others huddled in groups, clutching their loved ones and waiting for something, anything, that would help them understand the nightmare unfolding around them. Sheriff Bill Hankins stood at the center of the room, his face pale and eyes wide with disbelief. "We've got enough food and water to last a few days," he muttered, pacing back and forth. "But if more of those things get inside?" "Then we fight," Elijah interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "We're not going to sit here and wait for them to take us one by one." Bill stopped pacing and glanced at Elijah, his brow furrowed. "You're suggesting we go on the offensive?" "I'm saying we can't just hide and hope for a miracle. We need to take control of the situation, or this place will fall apart faster than we can blink." Bill took a long breath, his eyes scanning the room. The fear was palpable, people clung to each other, avoiding eye contact. A few children sobbed in the corner, and one man kept muttering to himself, unable to comprehend the horror unfolding outside the gym. Elijah had seen this before. In wars, in disasters, in the aftermath of destruction. People were paralyzed by fear. The human mind didn't know how to process something so monstrous, so impossible. But Elijah didn't have the luxury of denial. He knew that when the world came apart, it was survival or death. "We need weapons," Elijah said, turning toward the group of civilians who were trying to stay quiet. "Who here knows how to handle a gun?" A murmur rippled through the group. Slowly, a middle-aged man in a torn flannel shirt raised his hand. "I've got a hunting rifle at home," he said, his voice shaky. "Good. You and I are going to make sure we have enough to defend this place," Elijah said. He walked over and placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "If we're going to fight, we need to make every shot count. I'll need you to keep your head." The man nodded, though fear still clung to his face. Before they could discuss further plans, a loud crash echoed from the entrance of the gym. Everyone froze. A few seconds later, a terrified woman burst into the room, panting and wide-eyed. Her clothes were torn, and her hands were smeared with blood. "They're coming," she gasped, leaning against the doorframe. "I saw them, they're all over the place. I barely escaped. She collapsed before she could finish her sentence. Her body shook violently as she coughed up blood. Elijah rushed over, kneeling beside her, but it was too late. Her eyes stared lifelessly at the ceiling. She had been bitten. A cold silence fell over the room. No one knew what to do. The truth hit them all at once: if they were bitten, they were doomed. "Everyone, stay back!" Elijah yelled, jumping to his feet. He looked around the room quickly. "Bill, take charge and keep the civilians calm. I'm going to check outside, see how bad it is." Bill nodded and started to move towards the crowd, trying to get a hold of the situation. Outside, the sky was darkening with the first hints of dusk, and the air had a biting chill. Elijah stepped cautiously into the shadows behind the gym. His eyes scanned the trees, trying to make sense of the chaos. He could see figures in the distance, slow-moving, shuffling forms that were unmistakably human in shape, but something was off. They didn't move like people. Their jerky, unnatural movements made them appear more like machines than humans. Suddenly, a loud screech echoed from a nearby street. Elijah's pulse quickened. A pack of them, at least 20, appeared on the main road, moving in his direction. They had sensed the survivors. The hunger for flesh was all-consuming. His mind raced, calculating the next move. "There's no way we can hold out here much longer." A few hundred yards away, a truck stopped. 3 survivors, 2 men and a woman, climbed out, dragging a small cart full of supplies. They hadn't noticed the horde, but Elijah knew they wouldn't last long if they didn't act fast. He weighed his options: take the truck, get to the armory at the National Guard base a few miles away, and get more weapons and supplies. But that meant leaving the shelter exposed, and he wasn't willing to risk the lives of the others. His decision was made. He rushed back into the gym and found Bill. "We're leaving. Now. Everyone. Pack up, we're moving out to the truck." Bill raised an eyebrow, confusion written all over his face. "We're not ready. We need to barricade." "Not enough time," Elijah said sharply. He grabbed a flashlight and signaled toward the window. "Look out there. They're coming." The door to the gym slammed open. A lone man, bloodied and stumbling, rushed in, his eyes wide with terror. He collapsed just inside the door, gasping for air. "They're everywhere," he mumbled, before slipping into unconsciousness. Elijah cursed under his breath. The survivors' time was running out. They had to get out of there now. The fight for survival had begun. Next track button. End of part 2. Would you like to continue with part 3, or would you prefer a complete outline for all 8 parts? The gymnasium had descended into chaos. Elijah had hoped the transition would be smooth, everyone would pack up and get into the trucks, and they would drive to the National Guard base. But the reality was much darker. The survivors were scared. Parents grabbed their children in frantic desperation, unable to think clearly. Others stood frozen, paralyzed by fear or grief. The woman who had collapsed earlier had bitten 2 others before she died, and now their bodies lay crumpled, the infection already beginning to take hold. "We need to move now," Elijah shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. "If we stay here any longer, we'll be surrounded." Bill Hankins nodded, his face set in grim determination. He gathered a few volunteers who were willing to help and started ushering the others toward the back doors of the gym, which opened into an alley leading to the parking lot. Every few seconds, Elijah glanced out the window. The undead were growing in number, more and more appeared from the treeline, shambling down the main road, their guttural moans rising like a wave. The first vehicle, a battered pickup truck, was ready. Elijah had no idea how long they'd have to stay on the road, but he knew it wouldn't be long before the situation grew far worse. The group split into 2 groups, one group led by Elijah and Bill, the other by a young woman named Mara, who had a keen eye for organization. Elijah had asked Mara to take charge of the rear of the convoy to ensure no one would get left behind. Bill, meanwhile, had started to prepare the next group to follow. "All right," Mara said, her voice steady despite the situation. "Everyone in the truck now, let's move quickly." Elijah stood back and watched the survivors pile into the vehicles. He couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was more fragile than it appeared. They had to stay sharp. One wrong move, and everything could fall apart. The first truck rolled out of the parking lot, followed by a second. The third was still loading when the unmistakable sound of an engine caught Elijah's attention. His heart skipped a beat. He turned to look down the alley, and what he saw froze him in place. A large group of the undead had appeared out of nowhere, moving with the eerie slowness that was characteristic of the infected, but there were too many of them to count. At least 50. Elijah didn't have time to think. He ran to the second truck. "Move! Move! Get it started," he shouted, his voice cracking with urgency. The driver hesitated for only a second before the engine roared to life. Elijah jumped into the passenger seat. They had no time to waste. Outside, Mara's group was already starting to move toward the road. But the zombies were closing in. "Go!" Elijah yelled. The truck in front of them lurched forward, driving toward the main road. The first truck was already in full motion, kicking up dust as it sped away from the gym. Elijah's truck followed, and the convoy's engine growls echoed through the still air, a desperate song of survival. But as they turned the corner onto the main road, they realized the nightmare wasn't just in the woods, it was everywhere. Zombies filled the streets, aimlessly wandering, but some were quick to notice the movement and began to shamble toward them with disturbing speed. The driver slammed on the brakes. "There's no way through this way," he shouted. Elijah cursed under his breath, looking around. The streets were blocked by cars. Behind them, the undead were closing in. They were trapped. "Where's the third truck?" Elijah demanded, scanning the rearview mirror. Back at the gym, Mara said, panic rising in her voice. They're still loading. We can't leave them behind. Forget the truck, Elijah snapped, his hands gripping the wheel. We're going around. We don't have time to waste. He pointed toward a narrow alley between two buildings. Head that way. We'll take the back streets. The truck veered sharply, and they raced down the alley. Elijah's heart was pounding. He didn't know how long they could keep this up. The zombies were everywhere, and the roads were only getting more blocked with abandoned cars and wreckage. The truck sped through narrow streets, swerving to avoid overturned vehicles and wrecked storefronts. Elijah's mind raced, calculating the next move. If they could make it to the old industrial area on the edge of town, they might be able to find refuge. But the way was dangerous, and the undead were relentless. As they turned another corner, Elijah's worst fear materialized. The industrial area was already overrun. Hundreds of undead were shuffling along the streets, their grotesque forms stumbling and colliding with one another. Some of them had no legs. Others dragged themselves by their arms. A few were covered in dirt, their skin falling off in chunks. But amidst the horror, there was a glimmer of something else, movement. It was too organized to be random. The undead were gathering in a way that seemed deliberate. Elijah, look. Mara pointed toward the far end of the industrial district. He turned, his heart sinking as he saw what she was pointing at. At the far end of the street stood a group of humans, people, survivors, fighting for their lives. They were battling the undead with what little they had, makeshift weapons, rocks, sticks. They were fighting to survive, but they were outnumbered, surrounded. This is it, Elijah muttered, his voice filled with resolve. We need to join them. We fight, or we die. Elijah looked at Bill and Mara, his eyes hardening with determination. Let's make it count. Elijah's heart raced as the truck screeched to a halt just a few hundred feet from the group of survivors in the industrial district. The moment the wheels stopped turning, he jumped out of the vehicle, grabbing his rifle from the back seat. We move fast. We need to link up with them, now. Elijah shouted, his voice sharp and commanding. His pulse was pounding in his ears. The streets ahead were packed with zombies, but there was no turning back. The survivors in the industrial area were their only chance. Bill and Mara followed him, guns in hand. Behind them, the remaining survivors began unloading from the trucks, each of them moving quickly but cautiously. As Elijah sprinted toward the survivors at the end of the street, he couldn't help but notice the sheer chaos around him. The air was thick with the groans of the undead, the growls growing louder and more frantic. The infected were closing in from all sides, but they weren't just stumbling aimlessly, they were moving with purpose, herding together, tightening the noose around the survivors trapped in the industrial zone. We have to push through. Elijah barked, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of weakness. He could see the survivors holding their ground, but they were overwhelmed, and with each passing second, the number of undead surrounding them increased. The man in charge of the survivors, a stocky man named Roger, locked eyes with Elijah as he ran up. His face was covered in sweat, his eyes wild with panic but determined. We're running out of ammo. Roger shouted over the chaos. If we don't get out of here soon, we're done for. Elijah nodded grimly, but there was no time for words. We're not running. We're fighting our way out. The trucks are just up the street. If we can break through this horde, we can make it back to the highway. Roger looked as though he might argue, but there was no time to waste. The first wave of zombies came barreling toward them, howling in a maddened frenzy. Now! Elijah shouted, firing his rifle into the nearest group of undead. His shot landed true, taking down two infected with one bullet. But it barely slowed the horde. Bill and Mara opened fire beside him, sending bullets into the mass of grotesque forms. The sounds of gunfire echoed down the streets, mingling with the shrill moans of the zombies. Each shot seemed to buy them only a moment more of breathing room. The survivors had made a makeshift barricade out of scrap metal and discarded furniture. It was flimsy but enough to provide some cover. Elijah ducked behind it, pausing just long enough to reload. He glanced over at Bill and Mara. "We pushed them back, little by little," Elijah said, gritting his teeth. "Get as many people through as we can. I'll cover you." Mara nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her rifle. "On your signal," she said. Elijah took a deep breath, steadying himself. There was no time to hesitate. The fate of everyone here rested on this moment. The group of survivors was depending on him to lead them through this nightmare. "Now!" Elijah shouted again. They broke from cover, running toward the opening in the barricade. The undead didn't hesitate. They surged forward, a wave of pale, bloodshot eyes and decayed flesh. The survivors fired into the mob as they pushed their way forward, trying to clear a path. It was chaos, gunfire, screaming, and the sickening sound of flesh tearing. Elijah's rifle barked again, sending another zombie crashing to the ground. But the horde didn't stop. For every one they brought down, 2 more took its place. "Move!" Bill yelled, shoving one of the survivors toward the gap in the barricade. "Get to the trucks!" One by one, the survivors began to break free of the barricade, rushing toward the street. But the undead were relentless, and with every step they took, the zombies pressed in tighter, closer, clawing at their heels. "Not fast enough!" Elijah shouted, as a woman screamed behind him. A zombie had lunged at her, its teeth sinking deep into her leg. She fell to the ground with a cry, the sound of her body hitting the asphalt muffled by the deafening roar of the horde. "No!" Elijah bellowed, his heart breaking. But there was no time to mourn. "Cover me!" Elijah called to Mara and Bill. He turned toward the fallen woman, running as fast as he could. He reached her just as another zombie grabbed her by the arm. Without thinking, Elijah fired his gun into the creature's skull, pulling the woman away just in time. "Go, go, go!" he screamed. "We're almost there." With one final push, they reached the trucks. Bill and Mara were already in the first truck, helping the others inside. Elijah slammed the door to the second truck and jumped into the driver's seat. "Hold on," he shouted, gunning the engine. The truck roared to life, and the tires spun in the dirt before catching traction and surging forward. But as they tore down the street, Elijah glanced in the rearview mirror. The horde was still coming. They couldn't outrun it, not forever. The undead had the advantage of numbers. As the truck reached the highway, Elijah's mind raced. There had to be a way out, a way to survive this. But for now, they were free. For now, they had escaped. But it wouldn't last long. Next track button. End of part 4. Would you like to proceed with part 5, or would you like me to give an outline for the remainder of the story? The truck rumbled along the highway, the engine's growl breaking the eerie silence that had descended upon the group. The survivors, exhausted and silent, were scattered across the vehicles, some with their eyes closed, others staring blankly out of the windows. The weight of the battle still hung heavy in the air. Elijah kept his eyes on the road, his hands gripped tightly on the steering wheel. The night was closing in fast, and their chances of making it to safety were growing slimmer by the minute. Every mile that passed was another reminder of the world they used to know, the world they had lost. Behind him, Bill sat quietly in the second truck, his face etched with worry. Mara was beside him, her eyes darting nervously from the rearview mirror to the sky, as though expecting the undead to appear out of the shadows at any moment. They had all seen what the horde was capable of, and even though they had escaped for now, they knew this fragile peace wouldn't last long. "We need to find a place to lay low," Mara said quietly, her voice barely audible above the sound of the engine. "We can't keep driving forever." Elijah didn't answer immediately. He knew Mara was right. They couldn't stay on the road, constantly running. They needed a plan, a place to regroup and fortify themselves. But where? "We'll figure it out," Elijah finally said, his voice weary but resolute. "We just need to get as far as we can. Somewhere we can stay out of sight until we find a way to fight back." "We don't have the supplies for that," Bill said, his voice laced with concern. "We're running low on ammo, and most of the food we managed to grab is already going bad. Elijah nodded, the weight of their situation pressing on him. There were no easy answers, and the more they drove, the more he could feel the tension building inside him. They were on the edge of a precipice, and he wasn't sure how much longer they could keep from falling. A low growl of thunder sounded in the distance, the sky above growing darker as a storm approached. Elijah could feel the pressure mounting, the ominous feeling of something impending. The storm might give them some cover, but it could also bring more chaos. The roads would be harder to navigate, and they'd be exposed, vulnerable. "Look out!" Mara suddenly shouted, her voice high with panic. Elijah slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt just in time. In front of them, a large, dilapidated vehicle was blocking the road, its engine still running, its headlights casting an eerie glow in the dim light. The vehicle's windows were shattered, and the door hung open. "Stay alert," Elijah muttered, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle at his side. He scanned the area, watching for any movement. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, the sensation of being watched crawling over him. "Should we check it out?" Bill asked cautiously. Elijah didn't answer right away. He was considering the risks. A seemingly abandoned vehicle could be a trap, a decoy to lure survivors into an ambush. But at the same time, they needed supplies, desperately. And if someone had already ransacked it, they'd be wasting time. "Let's check it out," Elijah finally decided. "But stay sharp. Mara, cover us from the truck." Mara nodded silently, her grip tightening around her rifle. The tension in the air was palpable as Elijah and Bill cautiously approached the vehicle. The inside was a mess. Blood splattered the seats, and empty cans of food and water bottles were scattered across the floor. It looked like someone had been there recently, and judging by the bloodstains, it hadn't ended well for them. "Elijah," Bill's voice was strained. He had spotted something near the back of the vehicle, half hidden under a tarp. Elijah walked over, his boots crunching on broken glass, and pulled the tarp aside. It was a body. A man, dressed in torn clothes, his skin pale and bloated. His face was unrecognizable, his eyes wide open in a permanent expression of terror. The man had clearly been dead for hours, but something about the way he was sprawled across the seat sent a chill down Elijah's spine. "This doesn't feel right," Mara's voice crackled through the radio. "You guys need to hurry up." "Roger that," Elijah muttered, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The storm was getting closer, and if they didn't leave soon, they'd be stuck in the middle of it. Bill was already rifling through the vehicle's compartments, pulling out whatever supplies he could find. He tossed a few cans of food and bottles of water into a bag before he nodded at Elijah. "We're good to go. Let's get out of here." But as they turned to leave, a sudden, sickening sound echoed from behind them, a growl, low and guttural, rising from the shadows. Elijah froze, his hand on his rifle. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Slowly, he turned, his eyes scanning the darkness. Then he saw it. Emerging from the shadows, a group of zombies had appeared from behind a nearby building, their figures twisted and grotesque. They were not shuffling aimlessly like the others Elijah had encountered, they were fast. Too fast. "Elijah!" Bill shouted, his voice panicked. "We're surrounded." Elijah's mind raced. There was no time to think. They had to fight their way out. There was no other option. "Get back to the trucks. Now!" Elijah shouted, grabbing Bill by the arm. They turned and sprinted toward the vehicles, the sound of snarling undead close behind them. The storm was almost upon them, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. But the zombies were faster than Elijah had expected. A few were already closing in on them, their hands reaching out with terrifying speed. "Keep moving!" Elijah yelled as he fired his rifle, taking down one of the zombies in his path. They made it to the trucks just in time, scrambling inside as the undead drew closer. Elijah slammed the door shut, his heart racing as the truck roared to life. The storm hit just as they pulled onto the road, the heavy rain falling in sheets, making it almost impossible to see. the headlights barely cut through the darkness. Elijah could only hope that the storm would give them the cover they desperately needed, but deep down, he knew the truth. This was just the beginning. The world they once knew was gone, and now, they would have to fight for every inch of survival. The truck's tires screeched as Elijah floored the accelerator, trying to outrun the encroaching storm and the growing horde of zombies behind them. The rain came down in torrents, the windshield wipers struggling to clear the deluge. The roads were slick, and the visibility was near zero. Every turn felt like a gamble, every bump and jolt a reminder that they were on the edge of survival. Beside him, Bill and Mara sat in tense silence, their faces illuminated by the eerie glow of the dashboard lights. The sound of the rain hitting the roof of the truck was deafening, but it couldn't drown out the frantic pounding of Elijah's heart. The storm wasn't just a physical challenge, it was a metaphor for everything they were facing, chaotic, unpredictable, and relentless. "We can't keep going like this," Bill muttered, his voice barely audible above the storm's roar. "We're running out of gas, and the longer we're on the road, the harder it will be to keep ahead of them." Elijah didn't reply. He knew Bill was right. The roads were empty, and there was nothing but the endless expanse of rain-soaked pavement in front of them. They were driving blind, with no clear destination in mind, and the storm was only adding to the suffocating feeling of being lost. Every mile they put behind them only seemed to bring them further into the unknown. Mara, sitting in the back seat, leaned forward, her hand gripping the edge of the seat as she peered out the side window. "We can't keep running," she said quietly. "We need to find a place to hole up. Somewhere we can regroup, plan, and make sure we're not just surviving, but fighting back." Elijah glanced at her through the rearview mirror. He could see the fire in her eyes, the same fire that had driven her to keep going through every battle, every close call. But even her optimism had a grim edge now. She had seen the horrors of the world firsthand, and now, she was beginning to realize that surviving wasn't enough anymore. "We'll find somewhere," Elijah said, though his voice didn't carry the same conviction it once had. He was growing tired, physically and mentally. The weight of leadership, the constant pressure of being the one to make decisions, was starting to take its toll. They drove for hours, the storm showing no sign of letting up. The only sound besides the roar of the engine and the rain was the occasional radio static. The world outside felt like a distant memory, a place they could never return to. The highways, once bustling with traffic, were now nothing more than empty roads leading nowhere. And then, through the haze of rain, Elijah saw something up ahead, a flicker of light. "Look," he said, his voice rising with a mixture of hope and suspicion. "What is that?" Bill squinted through the rain, trying to make sense of the shadowy shape ahead. "It looks like a sign, like a gas station, maybe." "Let's check it out," Mara said, already pulling her rifle from the bag and making sure the safety was off. "It could be a trap." Elijah hesitated but then nodded. The uncertainty of the open road was more terrifying than any potential danger at the station. They needed to stop, to reassess, to figure out their next move. A place to refuel, physically and mentally, was exactly what they needed. As they drew closer, the outline of a small, abandoned gas station became clear. The sign was half fallen, and the structure was dilapidated, but the flickering light from a nearby generator indicated that it was still in operation, at least partially. "Keep your guard up," Elijah said, slowing the truck as they approached the station. "This place is too quiet." They stopped a safe distance from the pumps, and Elijah motioned for Bill and Mara to follow him. The rain was coming down harder now, the sound like 1,000 drums pounding against the roof. They hurried toward the station, the floodwaters beginning to rise around their boots. Elijah could barely hear the sound of his own footsteps over the storm. The door to the station was hanging off its hinges, creaking ominously in the wind. Elijah pushed it open cautiously, his rifle at the ready. The inside was dark, but there was a faint glow coming from the back. "Anyone here?" Elijah called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. There was no response. He stepped inside, and the musty smell of stale air and rot filled his lungs. The shelves were empty, the counters overturned. But something felt different, off, as if they weren't alone. A sudden movement in the corner caught his eye. Elijah whipped his rifle around, but it was only a stray dog, soaked to the bone and shivering in the corner, its eyes wide and fearful. Mara let out a relieved sigh. "It's just a dog. I thought we were in trouble." Elijah relaxed, lowering his rifle. "It's been a long time since I've seen anything alive besides, well, the dead." Bill stepped forward, examining the shelves. "No food. No water. It's been picked clean. We'll have to keep looking." Elijah turned to the back of the building, his instincts telling him there was something more. He walked cautiously toward the source of the faint light. As he reached the back room, his heart skipped a beat. In the dim light, a small group of survivors was huddled together, 5, maybe 6 people, all of them looking equally lost and desperate. The man in charge of the group, an older guy with graying hair, stood up and held his hands out in a gesture of peace. "We don't want trouble," the man said, his voice raspy but calm. "We're just trying to survive, like you." Elijah exchanged a quick glance with Bill and Mara. There was something about the situation that felt wrong, too convenient, too easy. But at this point, they didn't have much choice. "We're not here to cause trouble," Elijah replied cautiously. "We just need supplies and a place to rest for a while." The older man nodded. "We've got some food and water. You're welcome to stay, but you should know, we've got a bigger problem." "What's that?" Elijah asked, his curiosity piqued. The man's face darkened. "We're not the only ones here. The Horde, they've been getting closer. It's only a matter of time before they find us." Elijah's stomach sank. The undead were never far away. And now, it seemed they were closing in on the last remnants of humanity. Next track button. End of part 6. Would you like to continue with part 7, or would you prefer an outline for the next parts? Elijah stared at the older man, his mind racing. The words "bigger problem" echoed in his mind like a distant drumbeat. The Horde. It was always the Horde, and it was always just a matter of time. But what did he mean by closer? They had heard the distant growls and screeches of the undead before, but nothing like this. The man, still holding up his hands in a gesture of peace, motioned for them to follow him. "I'll explain everything. But we need to move quickly. We've already heard them out there, getting louder with every passing hour." Bill stepped forward, his expression hardening. "How many? How close are they?" The older man shook his head grimly. "It's not about numbers anymore. They're drawn to sound, to movement, to life. And when they're hungry, they move like a tide. We're not safe here. Not for long." Elijah's mind spun with possibilities. This gas station, this fleeting moment of relative safety, was nothing more than a temporary refuge. He could feel it in his bones. The world had already moved beyond the point of safety. Every place, every face, every moment was fleeting. But he didn't say it out loud. They had been on the road for so long, fighting against the elements, the undead, and their own fears. A moment of respite was hard to come by, and he wasn't about to throw it away just yet. "Where's the safest place around here?" Elijah asked, his voice steady but tense. The older man nodded toward the back of the station. "We've been holding up in the storage area. It's locked, secure, well, as secure as it can be, with what we have." Mara looked toward the back room and then back at Elijah. Her eyes were filled with determination, but there was something else there too, doubt. They were running out of time. "Let's move," Elijah said, signaling for the others to follow. They moved quickly through the darkened station, and Elijah couldn't help but glance nervously out the windows, half expecting to see a wave of zombies appear through the sheets of rain. Every creak of the floorboards underfoot seemed to echo louder than it should, every gust of wind that rattled the station's exterior a reminder that they were all hanging by a thread. When they reached the storage area, the older man led them to a small door that creaked open with an eerie sound. Inside, the air was musty, and the walls were lined with old crates and boxes, some empty, some half full. The dim light from a single, flickering bulb cast long shadows against the walls. "We've made do with what we have," the older man said, pulling down a tarp to reveal a small stash of canned goods and bottled water. There was a fire barrel in the center, the flickering flames casting an orange glow that flickered across everyone's faces. As Elijah moved further into the room, he realized that it wasn't just a hiding spot, it was a place where they had been living, trying to carve out a semblance of normality amidst the chaos. But Elijah's gut told him it wouldn't be enough. Nothing ever was. Mara turned to the older man. "You said we weren't safe. What do you mean by that?" The man's face grew darker, his eyes scanning the room as if he could still hear the sounds of the undead outside. "The Horde, they're not the only thing we have to worry about. It's the others, people like us, but worse. Desperate." Elijah frowned. He knew what that meant. He had seen it before, groups of survivors willing to do anything to survive, even if it meant hurting others. And in this new world, desperation was a currency that could buy anything, including betrayal and death. "You've encountered other survivors?" Bill asked, his voice skeptical. "Yes," the older man said quietly. "They're out there. A group of them. And they're dangerous. We've had run-ins with them before, forced to fight for food, for supplies. And they don't care about right or wrong. They care about what they can take." Elijah clenched his fists. "Where are they now?" The man's eyes flicked to the door. "They're nearby. I don't know how much longer we have until they come for us again. And when they do," he trailed off, his face grim. "We're not equipped to fight them. Not with the Horde getting closer by the minute." Bill's hands curled into fists at his sides. "So, we're caught between two threats. The living and the dead." "Yes," the man replied, his voice tinged with bitterness. "And the dead don't play by any rules. They don't negotiate. They don't care if you're hungry or scared. All they want is to feed." Elijah's mind raced as he processed everything. They had a choice to make. They could wait for the Horde to arrive and hope they could survive the onslaught, or they could risk going after the dangerous group of survivors the older man had mentioned. Neither option felt good. But what was the alternative? "Do we stay here and wait?" Mara asked quietly, her voice heavy with the weight of their situation. Elijah took a deep breath, trying to focus. His instincts screamed at him to keep moving, to never sit still in a world like this. But he couldn't ignore the fact that the Horde was getting closer, and the unknown survivors posed a risk. They needed to take action, and they needed to take it now. "We can't stay here," Elijah finally said, his voice firm. "The Horde is too close. But we also can't let ourselves be picked off by other survivors. We need to find a way to fight back." He turned to the older man. "Where's the best place to fight them off? Where can we make a stand?" The older man paused, his eyes searching the room, then slowly nodded toward the far corner. "There's a water tower behind the station. It's isolated, elevated. We can use it as a stronghold for now. But we'll need to move fast. They'll be here soon." Next track button. End of part 7. Would you like me to proceed with part 8? Elijah's heart raced as the gravity of their situation sank in. The water tower. It was their best chance, an elevated position that could provide them with a strategic advantage. But the closer they got to the tower, the more exposed they'd become to the approaching Horde. They had no time to waste, and every second counted. "We need to move now," Elijah said, his voice steady but urgent. "Everyone grab what you can. We're making a run for it." Bill and Mara were already scanning the room for anything useful. Mara quickly packed a bag with extra ammo, while Bill loaded up a duffel with water and canned goods. Elijah turned back to the older man. "Lead the way," he said, and the man nodded, leading them out of the storage area and back into the rain-soaked night. The storm had only intensified, but the sound of thunder now mingled with the distant growl of the undead. Their time was running out. As they stepped outside, the cold, damp air hit them like a slap to the face. The rain pelted their skin, and the wind howled, making it hard to hear anything over the cacophony. But Elijah's eyes were locked on the water tower in the distance, its silhouette barely visible through the downpour. They moved quickly, their boots splashing through the rising floodwaters. The station's flickering lights were growing fainter behind them, replaced by the growing darkness of the storm. Elijah kept his senses sharp, alert for any signs of movement, any sounds of the horde closing in. Behind them, the older man muttered a prayer, his face pale with fear. "We're not going to make it." "We are," Elijah replied with more conviction than he felt. "We just have to keep moving." They reached the base of the water tower, their legs burning from the sprint. The tower loomed above them like a silent sentinel, its rusted metal frame creaking in the wind. The ladder to the top was slick with rain, but it was their only way up. "Go first," Elijah said to Bill, motioning to the ladder. "Mara, you're next. I'll cover you from the bottom." Bill nodded without a word and began climbing, his hands gripping the cold metal rungs with a steady determination. Mara followed closely behind, her eyes scanning the shadows for any signs of movement. Elijah's heart raced in his chest as he turned, watching the surroundings, knowing that any moment, they could be surrounded. The first step was to get up, to gain the height they needed to see what was coming. Once they were up there, they could decide their next move, but they had to hold the position. They had to fight. Suddenly, the unmistakable sound of footsteps splashing through the water reached Elijah's ears. His grip tightened around his rifle as his eyes darted to the side. He could see movement in the dark, a shadow moving in the rain. And then, there were more, too many. The horde was closing in. "Get up the tower. Now!" Elijah shouted, his voice sharp with urgency. Bill was already at the top, pulling Mara up behind him. Elijah was the last to climb, his muscles straining as he pulled himself up the rungs, the sound of the undead growing louder with every passing second. When Elijah finally reached the top, he collapsed on the platform, breathless and soaked to the bone. The view from the tower was disorienting, everything seemed to blur in the rain, but in the distance, he could see them. The undead. A sea of motionless figures, their decayed bodies swaying in the wind, drawn to the scent of life. "We're not safe up here for long," Bill said, his voice hoarse. "We need to figure out how to fight them off. We can't just wait until they're at the base." Elijah nodded, his mind racing. They had to hold their ground, but they had to do more than just wait. They needed a plan. "There's a tool shed near the base of the tower," the older man called out, his voice barely audible over the rain. "We could grab tools, weapons, anything to defend ourselves." Elijah turned to him. "Can you get to it?" The man nodded, his eyes flicking nervously to the horde. "I can try. But it's risky." "There's no time," Mara said, her hand tightening around the rifle slung over her shoulder. "We need to get it done now or we'll have no chance." Elijah looked out at the approaching undead. They weren't moving fast, but the tide was relentless. Every passing minute brought them closer to the tower. "We go together," Elijah decided. "Mara, you and I will go down and secure the shed. Bill, you stay up here and keep watch. If anything comes near, take it down." Bill nodded grimly, and with that, Elijah and Mara descended the ladder. The rain was coming down harder, but they couldn't let it slow them down. Every step they took was a race against time, a battle to reach the shed and gather anything they could use to survive. The closer they got to the tool shed, the more desperate the situation became. The first zombies appeared, staggering through the rain, their eyes glazed over with hunger. Elijah's heart pounded as he raised his rifle and took them down, each shot ringing out like thunder. Mara moved quickly, her rifle ready, as they reached the shed. The door was locked, but with one swift kick, it splintered open. Inside, there were tools, crowbars, hammers, axes, and more. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "Let's get back to the tower," Elijah said, already loading up on whatever weapons he could carry. "We can't waste any more time." They raced back, dodging the undead as they moved in for the kill. They were too many to fight off completely, but Elijah and Mara had no choice. They had to make a stand, or else they would become just another statistic in a world that had already forgotten the meaning of mercy. By the time they made it back to the tower, the undead were closing in on all sides. Bill had done his part, shooting down any zombies that came near. But the horde was too large to stop completely. With weapons in hand, the trio took their final stand. They fought with everything they had. Every shot, every swing, every movement was a battle for survival. The sound of the undead's moaning filled the air, mixing with the cries of the living as they fought for their lives. Elijah knew they couldn't win this fight. But they didn't have to. All they had to do was survive. And for the first time in a long while, the living fought back. Next track button. End of part 8. That concludes the story. Would you like to explore more story ideas or need help with anything else related to your content?